To stand with Palestine, transnational resistance and political evolution in the United States. That is the title of today's lecture, hosted by the Rutgers Law Center for Security, Race, and Rights as part of the annual Humanizing Palestine lecture series. I am Sahar Aziz, a distinguished professor here at Rutgers Law School and also the director of the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, which is also known as CSRR. CSRR is the first and only academic center at a U.S. law school that focuses on the civil and human rights of Muslims, Arabs, Palestinians, and South Asians. And we do so through a cross-racial, transnational, and interdisciplinary approach. I encourage all of you to follow the center on social media at Rutgers CSRR or at RUCSRR, and also to register for our future Humanizing Palestine lecture series by going to csrr.rutgers.edu and go to the lectures under events slide. And we also encourage you to watch our past lectures. We have over 100 lectures by renowned academics, experts, scholars, seasoned lawyers on our YouTube channel. So if you haven't already subscribed, go to YouTube and search for the Center for Security, Race, and Rights and subscribe. And finally, I have the distinct honor of being the host of the Race and Rights podcast, which you can find wherever podcasts are available. Now, for the work that CSRR does in defending, in educating, in researching and writing about the civil and human rights of Muslim, Arab, and Palestinians, CSR has been the target of multiple hate groups who want to specifically erase the voices, experiences, and analysis of Palestinians, especially here in the United States. Many of these hate groups self-identify themselves as pro-Israeli and Zionist, and perversely claim to be combating anti-Semitism at the very same time that they're actually fueling anti-Palestinianism and Islamophobia through their hate campaigns. And we believe here at the Center for Security, Race, and Rights that the best antidote to hate is education and open intellectual inquiry, which is precisely what American universities are best positioned to do. We invite experts who have spent years of their professional lives researching and writing on topics that affect law, policy, and society. For it is scholars and experts, not pundits and political hacks, whom we should rely on in understanding our complex world today. So toward that end, it is my distinct pleasure to host our esteemed expert today, Professor Karam Dana, to give a talk on his groundbreaking new book, To Stand with Palestine, Transnational Resistance and Political Evolution in the United States. Dr. Karam Dana is Professor of Middle East Politics and the Alison McGregor Distinguished Professor of Excellence in Transformative Research at the University of Washington, Bothell. He is the founding director of the American Muslim Research Institute, the co-principal investigator of the Muslim American Public Opinion Survey, and has led multiple public opinion surveys in the Arabic-speaking world, including the 2013 Palestinian Public Opinion Survey. Dr. Dana's scholarship focuses on political identities and transnationalism, with a particular emphasis on Muslim Americans in the United States and Palestinians, both in Palestine and across transnational spaces. And through his interdisciplinary lens, his work investigates the intersections of identity, racialization, and politics, addressing issues affecting marginalized communities worldwide. And I would be remiss not to highlight that we are privileged to have Professor Karam Dana as a faculty affiliate at the Center for Security, Race, and Rights. And so with that, thank you so much, Professor Dana, for your generosity of time and for sharing your expertise with us to discuss this exciting new book that you've just published. And the virtual floor is yours. Ya marhaba.
Shukran. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for the introduction. Quite generous introduction. I want to extend my thanks to Rutgers Law School, of course, and the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, and of course to my friend and wonderful scholar, Saharazi. So thank you for having me. I'm very honored to be here today. So given the fact that we don't have a lot of time, I would like to kind of condense what the book is all about. And I also want to mention a couple of things. That the book was in fact written before October 7th, 2023. Had the opportunity to touch it if I effectively and to kind of add a few things, the preface particularly after October 7th. So it was day 249. It was the last time I touched of the genocide during which, during the genocide that I was able to kind of add a few sentences. So I want you to kind of understand that this is more or less a larger process in terms of what the book really tries to capture here. The long process around which Palestine and Palestinians have been described and talked about in the context of the political landscape and socio-political landscape of the United States. So, well, we all notice that there's a transforming public opinion in the United States in relation to Palestine and Israel. It doesn't take much for us to notice that even, on CNN that we notice over the past 2 years. But that trend has actually, in fact, been taking place for quite some time. Well, originally, however, views in relation to Palestine and Palestinians have traditionally functioned as a kind of an offshoot, if I may, of Orientalism, and in fact encapsulates what Orientalism is in the context of the U.S., racializing Arabs and Muslims in an ahistoric way. There are certain ideas that racialize effectively how Arabs and Muslims and obviously Palestinians are being talked about, thought about, and so on. And in fact, that really determines quite a bit of how Palestinians have been thought of for decades in the United States. And really, the US and Israel's relationship is really kind of fuels much of those views in relation to Palestine and Palestinians. Now, that traditional narrative has been changing, as I mentioned. And in fact, what we have noticed over the past 2 decades or so, and particularly, and I say 2 decades and so, is that it's late 1990s is when this change started taking place. There has been an intensifying and, in fact, an accelerating battle that has been taking place in a variety of different spaces in the context of the United States, from law and legislations to the marketplace to how corporations and function and so on, to K through 12 education, to higher education, academic institutions, and even to pop culture, as we all know. But I want to say that this intensifying and accelerating battle seems to, in fact, parallel the level of violence perpetrated against Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and inside Israel, inside Palestine in 1948, for example. This population of Palestinians being subjugated to different forms of violence and so on, in fact, parallels that intensification and the sophistication parallels in some ways what is happening in the United States. So you find that those who are advocating practices of the state of Israel are on the one hand, and then those who are, advocating for Palestinian equal rights, kind of fighting in the public space in a variety of different spaces in the context of the U.S. And in fact, that is accelerating. And this is in fact what we are witnessing today. And I'll get back to you, get back to this later on, if I may. So, in fact, I would have argued in the book that Palestine has long been central to American politics. I mean, we talk about the due process aspects of due process, aspects of rights, aspect and First Amendment and so on. All of those things are centered around the question of Palestine. So it is more in more recent years, and in fact, the last 2 years, people are noticing that Palestine is central, but it has been there for a while. It's just now that we're noticing it increasingly, noticing such change. But there have been the argument that I'm making here is that there have been multiple socio-political transformations that are taking place in the context of the US. Particularly have been taking place globally as well, not only the United States, but there's a global change. But there's also something in relation to Palestine and Palestinians, which I think is very significant and important. We oftentimes do not talk about the fact that Palestinian diaspora is in fact more than Palestinians living in historic Palestine, Palestine before 1948, West Bank, Gaza Strip, and Palestine 48. We don't think about, what this particular diaspora is capable of doing, especially that they're scattered around the world. So effectively, in 1948, the Nakba created a catastrophe whereby Palestinian society was destroyed. There was a destruction, an intentional destruction of Palestinian society that created multiple Palestinian communities, obviously, around the world. The interesting thing is that over time, these particular communities, these Palestinians, have themselves kind of claimed their own agency. They have acquired agency over time to, in fact, fight against Israeli settler colonialism in Palestine, in different spaces, not necessarily directly on the ground, on the geography of Palestine, but in fact outside of Palestine. This isn't to say that Palestinians and Palestine are irrelevant in this conversation. In fact, there's that connection between the diaspora Palestinians and Palestinians living under Israeli occupation in Palestine. And in fact, some of the data that I have collected looked at linked fate. Oftentimes in the United States, when we study BIPOC communities and the connections between, co religionists, for example, people with certain religious identity that are similar, or people with particular racial and or ethnic identity. We oftentimes ask them the level of commonality with each other and the linked fate. So if something happens to one particular person who shares your identity, does that affect your life? Palestinians score quite high, very high, in fact, compared to other diaspora communities, comparatively speaking. So what that tells me, this is what the evidence suggests here, is that there's a connection between people on the ground living in Israeli occupation, under Israeli occupation, and Palestinians living outside of Palestine who may or may not have actually been able to connect physically with the geography of Palestine. So that's something interesting in relation to how the Palestinian dynamic works, right? Palestinians in Palestine, Palestinians living in diaspora communities. So in a nutshell, effectively, we can think about the intentional destruction of Palestinian society created a Palestinian society that is beyond the immediate control of Israel. And that is something quite interesting. And a lot of people don't necessarily think about this as something significant. So let me kind of bring us back to the different processes that I've mentioned that are really the bulk and the entire argument of the book. It took me a while to put it all together, but there are three types of processes. Palestine specific, that's one. Palestinian specific. The second one is that global that I mentioned earlier. And then the third processes are US-based processes. So the first one in relation to Palestine and Palestinians, as I mentioned, there's that Palestinians living in diaspora is one thing. But the second piece to it is Palestinians living under Israeli occupation. Increasingly over the decades, Palestinians have been subjugated to, as I mentioned, intensifying forms of violence and control under Israeli occupation. But one thing that we noticed taking place and changing was early on in the earlier 21st century. So the early 2000s. It was during the second Intifada that broke out in 2000. And a few years later, the level of violence that had taken place in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip was, I don't want to call it unprecedented, but it had taken a dangerous turn whereby deaths started piling up and there was no actual reaction from a global community, primarily, obviously, Western societies and Western governments. So then a group of Palestinian civil society leaders came together and realized that they needed to do something about this. And then they kind of issued a call for all people of conscience around the world to engage in a decentralized movement, effectively, what is known today as boycott, divestment, and sanctions. It was basically to boycott companies that are working for Israel, divest from companies that work with Israel, and ultimately pursuing sanctions against the practice of the State of Israel. So BDS effectively was born out of a transnational call, right, from Palestinians living in Palestine. And of course, the connection that Palestinians living in transnational spaces who are in the exile and diaspora are engaged in this idea of boycotting, divestment, and sanctions, of course, but in the sense that really created one particular process. So let's stop there, and then I'm happy to get back to it. The second one has to do with the technological innovations that have been taking place. There's obviously the internet and social media. What's interesting about the internet and social media is that when the internet was introduced, it provided more content. It might have been very difficult to approach it and to be able to find it on the interwebs, right? I remember those days. But when social media, which is also a function, of course, of the internet and that interconnectedness of the world, and that transnational processes taking place and transnational ideas and thought process that takes place on social media, really created a global community, if I may. And it's not only Palestine specific, obviously, but it created a relatively younger generation that really is exposed to ideas that their previous generations, previous in those societies have not been able to be exposed to. So this is the kind of the global piece of it, and I'm happy to get into it. I mean, you notice now that there's a global kind of global generational shift, not only Palestine related, but in general. You've got young people are pissed off, like they're really kind of not happy about the environment. They're not happy about the economics that they have to deal with, the economic conditions, the political economy of it, etc. Um, and then the third piece to this, which is kind of refocusing the book around Palestine, it's kind of the socio-political changes that are taking place, particularly particularly in the United States over the past 25 years or so. So in particular, in 1999, there was a protest in Seattle, where I live, for against the WTO, the World Trade Organization's meeting. And in fact, delegates from around the world came and descended upon Seattle, but also a lot of activists from around the United States came to Seattle. And there was what is known the Battle of Seattle, okay, whereby you found the police attacking protesters who were exercising their rights of free speech and so on, and freedom of protest. So they were attacked in a way that violence had not been used in American cities. And mind you, this isn't to say that violence has not been used in the past in American cities. We know, we understand Philadelphia, neighborhoods were blown up by the police. We understand that, bombing neighborhoods. We've seen also the civil rights movement, and I can go on. The LA riots, there have been those moments. But this particular moment in history created a shift whereby the militarization of the police became a more intensifying process, intensified and kind of was seen and pushed for as a legitimate tool to curb protest. Okay. And the interesting thing is that we notice a lot of that is actually paralleling this particular, the contemporary moment that we're living through. At any rate, so a lot of the military equipment was passed down to the police during in the years after that, and especially after 9/11. 9/11 happened, the securitization of the United States becomes significant and becomes part of how the government does business effectively. So it really created more or less, whichever way you want to look at it, there has been a divide, a crack effectively between how the state and society see things. And in terms of some people might like it and some people may not like it. But ultimately, there have been, economic kind of disparities and economic, I want to call it anger, economic perceived relative deprivation that have really been felt by the right and the left, in addition to the fact that there's a militarization of the police. On top of that, there's an increased surveillance, and people's rights have been slowly eroding over time. So this is kind of really a significant moment in American history. And then in addition to this, since the early 2000s, the conversations around race and equity transformed, have taken place in different spaces. I mean, in particular, we're talking LGBTQ plus rights, for example, the ability for same-sex marriage to take place, that have become part of the public sector, public sphere conversations. And over time, that was created a possibility for gay marriage to take place, right, legally. And then that created space. In addition to this, of course, there's the racial and ethnic conversation of the United States. I mean, the U.S. is an entire society based on racial hierarchy. It's based on how white supremacy operates. There's a hierarchy in terms of racial and ethnic identities in the U.S. And in some ways, this conversation continued to transform in the U.S. Over time. But again, as I mentioned, over the past 20 years. I want to highlight in particular that Palestinian Americans, in fact, mobilized along marginalized communities, other marginalized communities in the United States. So they were, in fact, part of these communities, and they saw injustice and were able themselves to understand their struggle through other marginalized people's struggles. Okay. And then there are a couple of technical things here in particular that there are less church attendance in the United States over the past 50 or so years. It's oftentimes referred to as kind of the great decline of religiosity in the US, that people don't particularly go to church as a cultural matter that it used to be a defining thing in American society. And the reason why I say this, and this is part of the reasons that I mention as to why Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims have been racialized and thought of through that Orientalist lens, is that churches in the United States, not all, obviously, but in the sense, by and large, American form of Protestant Christianity and evangelical Christianity in particular, sees the fulfillment, obviously, which the argument that we all know, dispensationalism, which is the idea of the literal translation of the Bible and the New Testament, whereby you have the creation of Israel as kind of the step one of the return of the Messiah. So the less church attendance taking place, the less that argument is becoming less salient in American society's minds. This isn't to say that the church itself or the theology, but also it has to do with how leadership of churches. And I get into the details of this in the book in terms of how churches think about this and how they, in fact, speak about this. And we all understand that evangelical Christians are some of the most ardent supporters of Israel, right or wrong, effectively. Again, sorry, I'm generalizing here, but the idea here is that it's quite dominant. There's more of that push to kind of lead to the manifestation of that particular prophecy of the return of Messiah. There's also another thing that we cannot minimize, which is the increasing number of Jewish American figures. And I don't necessarily mean very only important academics and important Jewish American figures and so on, but also the number of Jewish Americans who see themselves as as being more or less their identities being hijacked by the state of Israel and its practices, by how Zionism is manifesting, and the fact that manifesting their own identities as one that is connected to Zionism, and that the fact that that Israel speaks on behalf of all Jews in the world. A lot of people have a problem with that. And then obviously we understand that there has always been Jewish people who are against Zionism, against the settler colonial project in Palestine. But at the same time, those numbers have increased dramatically over time. And as we notice, in fact, data that came out after publishing the book has shown that those numbers are in fact increasing and have increased quite a bit. In fact, that there are a lot of Jewish Americans who are against Zionism or don't see themselves as Zionists in terms of in the way it is defined. And of course, there's the legal conversation here, the IRA definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism that includes critique of Israel, well, it includes the critique of Jewish self-determination as a form of anti-Semitism, but it oftentimes interpreted as the manifestation of this particular idea is the manifestation in Israel, effectively. So, in a sense, in a nutshell, this is what the book is all about. It really thinks about the experience of the experiences and perspectives of Palestinians living in diaspora, are able to engage in connecting the local struggles of other BIPOC communities to their own, and also advocating for Palestine in a variety of spaces. And as we're noticing now that there's now a transforming kind of public opinion, but it's not only about public opinion. It's about, you know, it's about the fight that is intensifying in a variety of spaces, from law to the academy to pop culture to the film industry to, and, we can go on and on in terms of where that change is happening. And I kind of get into that in details in the book. But the interesting thing, I was asked once whether or not October 7th has affected the book. And in fact, my argument, and in fact, what I would say is that what the world that we have lived through since October 7th and the genocide, ensuing genocide, and so on, that hopefully will cease to continue soon. That in fact those arguments have been reinforced by what happened after October 7th, because there's a structural piece to this that takes a long time. And the last very close example that I had looked at in terms of the reaction and the backlash in the context of the U.S. in minute details was the May 2021 Sheikh Jarrah uh, um, situation, whereby Palestinians were being expelled from their homes, and so on. And I think that created the largest backlash yet. And again, we notice that the space oftentimes is social media, but the space is also boycotting. The space is also engaging in conversations at board meetings within corporations. It's taking place in academic spaces, administrators, and also university faculty. Unions and faculty senates and so on. So you'll find a conversation taking place in a variety of different spaces, as I mentioned, and it will continue. I mean, the way I see it is that there will be much more intensifying fight. It will continue to intensify, but it cannot remain like that. And ultimately, part of the issue is how the United States has supported, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican administration, has supported Israel with billions of dollars and weaponry. Of course, the past couple of years have been bankrolled on American tax dollars, as we all know. But part of this is in fact not part of the issue. This is the central piece of the issue. And ultimately, when people are fighting on one side against some of those practices, there's a doubling down from the other side, effectively. And this is what we're noticing, that intensification that is taking place. But we also notice a fracture. We notice that is not going to be sustainable in the long term. And okay, I think this is my time. I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you all for taking the time to listen to my conversation.
Thank you so much, Professor Dana. You gave us a lot to think about, and I will just encourage everyone to purchase the book, To Stand with Palestine, Transnational Resistance and Political Evolution in the United States, because it is rich with facts. And I think it is important to note that the research that you conducted and the completion of the manuscript was before October 7th, 2023. And it does show kind of this evolution of political shift. You brought something up that I wanted to unpack a bit, which was the integration of Palestinian Americans or Palestinians in Europe, in the Western world, but let's focus on the US, with the anti-racism movement, which I think we can credit in large part, at least in our lifetime, with the Black Lives Matter movement and the criminal justice reform movement that started even before then, and the kind of cross-racial coalitions that have been building, and some of them also as a response to the first Trump administration and to the targeting of Latinx communities that has now come back with a vengeance, multiple times worse, unfortunately, and also with the Muslim ban, and also with the attacks against the LGBTQ community and particularly pointed attacks against the transgender community. So you have multiple marginalized communities or non-majority communities who experience this sense of subjugation or subordination. And could you tell us a little bit more about how Palestine fit into that, and especially with regard to not just Palestinian Americans, but Jewish Americans and people of color. But how did that happen based on your research? How did that become integrated as opposed to siloed as this separate foreign policy issue that really was the way it was framed in the 80s and 90s?
That's a wonderful question. And it's really multifaceted. The very first thing I want to mention is that we have to think about the Palestinian diaspora itself and having settled in these different spaces and understood the sociopolitical landscape in which they live. That's the first part. So not only, I mean, let's focus on the United States, like you mentioned. I don't want to particularly, there's a lot in Europe that I can go into. But but in the context of the US, you notice that a lot of the Palestinian activists who have lived in the United States for decades understand the plight of other BIPOC communities. So they're able to, as I mentioned in my talk earlier, that there's a mobilization moment, that they were part of the mobilization itself, first of all. And then two, they were able to kind of understand what is salient in the minds of of those with whom they actually organize. And I'm also saying this here. It is generational, but it is not generational all the time. So in a sense, there you will always have had someone who spoke about Palestinian rights, always, and it's not only Palestinians, but also Palestinian advocates as well, for decades now. How did that become a much more deeper interconnected to this? It is the forces that are taking place in the United States. It is, in fact, the post 9/11 world that has led to people being targeted, and not only the quote unquote the so-called terrorists and the so-called particular racialized communities, but in fact that these types of policies affect all of us. They don't only affect Muslims, they don't affect only Palestinians, they don't affect only um, Arabs, and so on and so forth. Obviously, as you've mentioned, other communities have faced other kinds of faced similar types of discriminatory policies. But that's one thing. But then, in addition to this, I also cannot emphasize the significance of being able to communicate your plight in ways that other people understand it. And look, as someone who has been thinking about this for a long time, I mean, I've been writing this book for a long time. We don't usually like to tell you exactly how long. It's about 8 years that it took me to write the book, okay? Because I had to think about it from a variety of aspects. The first is, why is it that Americans don't see the humanity of Palestinians? That was one of those things. It's like, I understand Orientalism, trust me, I do, right? I understand the racialization, trust me, I do. But why? Why is it that if you replace a Palestinian by anybody else, there's more sympathy? And then that took me on the path of trying to figure out why. And then also at the same time, we noticed that there's a change. So we have to change from point A to point B. What happened? So what really happened is the fact that people were able to communicate their own plight in language folks understand on the ground in their own communities. And we noticed this during the Black Lives Matter movement, obviously. Nothing like the Black Lives Matter movement was so significant. I mean, I wanna emphasize the significance of the Black Lives Matter movement, especially that it saw itself as a transnational movement. It saw itself as something that will have to break the shackles of colonialism. It's the idea of understanding what colonialism is, that it took a long time. And I don't mean this in a negative way. There's a good chunk of the book that I talk about education, as you know, right? Around which I say, like, people don't know much about the rest of the world. I mean, no matter how you look at it, there's very limited knowledge, first of all. And then two, when it gets to Palestine and Israel, the vast majority of which is, in fact, kind of based around some of those theological ideas, that there's a lot of that narrative that has been kind of framed in a way that people cannot easily escape. And oftentimes you always heard like it's too complicated, but then the younger generation they're not taken too complicated as a thing, right? They're not accepting it. The too complicated is not something that they were comfortable with, so they started asking questions. And this is, I mean, now the TikTok, which, I mean, TikTok is a very interesting case right now because TikTok is now bought by people who are not necessarily um, in favor of having the pro-Palestinian message to be passed on its platform freely. That's what at least some of the commentary around it. But a lot of those look, there's something to be said about the fact that BIPOC communities have understood the plight of the Palestinians for a long time. It just increased in more recent years. There's something to be said about the global South understanding the plight of the Palestinians for decades, since day one, to understand what colonialism is, because they themselves were colonized. There's something about that that accelerated that in more recent years. So how did it happen? It happened with that level of integration that you're mentioning, in the sense that where people saw the plight of other people similar to their own, and they were able to be an integral part. I mean, Palestinian Americans, just to use an example, and pro-Palestinian voices and advocates for Palestinian equal rights. Um, it can be anyone, including Jewish Americans. Over time, they understood that the official narrative is not the official narrative that actually reflects reality. So I think it has to do more about accurate information and accurate framing of the information that is really has transformed much of what we see today.
Well, thank you for that. And that's actually a good segue into my next question, which I'll preface with a comment. It's no surprise then that those who are so pro-Israeli and so Zionist, again, this is how they identify themselves, are attacking universities, are attacking faculty, are attacking students of various identities, although the face of those attacks is intentionally the Muslim face, the Arab face, the Palestinian face, in order to trigger, right, the very deeply entrenched racism against this, which is grounded in Orientalism and racialization. But the way that knowledge and communication and knowledge production has now been targeted is something that is worth highlighting and worth noting. There are many people in this country, in the state of New Jersey, who don't even want you and I to have this conversation. And the way that they'll frame it, perversely again, and very inaccurately, is that it's anti-Semitic. To just humanize Palestinians is anti-Semitic. To listen to their perspectives that may be critical of a Zionist perspective or of the Israeli official perspective is anti-Semitic, which of course creates this false zero-sum game and really, in bad faith, pits two communities against each other when they have a lot more in common and a lot of more reasons to work together. So I just want to highlight two things, and I'll ask you your thoughts on this. Is the first is, while you were talking about the polling, on October 5th, 2025, the Washington Post issued a poll that said that nearly 40% of American Jews believe Israel has committed genocide against Palestinians in Gaza. 40% of American Jews. But if you were to listen to the organizations that claim to represent American Jews, they are, if not outright supportive of Netanyahu, who is about as far right as one can get at this point in Israeli history, or at least an apologist for what he is doing. And then second is the law that has allowed these establishment Jewish organizations, I put establishment in quotes, who again, I think are misrepresenting the perspectives and the positions, the political positions of American Jews, which are diverse like any other community, is this weaponization of the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, the International Holocaust Remembrance Act, which I'll put in a pitch for the issue brief that we just published with the Center for Security, Race, and Rights. Dr. Rod Siegel and myself co-authored it. The issue brief is called Threats to Free Speech and Palestinian Civil Rights, the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, which I encourage people to read. It's available on csr.rutgers.edu. So that has been now codified into law across the countries. It's being proposed in New Jersey in the legislature. I believe the California Governor Newsom just signed it. Many universities have incorporated the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, which effectively would prohibit any type of critique, or certain types of critique, I should say, is very viewpoint based and very content based, which of course raises all sorts of First Amendment questions about Israel. Even if the motivation for doing so is because you as a Palestinian are being harmed by the actions and policies and laws of Israel, or you have family there, you have friends there, or you just morally are opposed to what's happening. So what are your thoughts on these attacks on universities and students and faculty?
Thank you. This is a very critical moment in history, I think, not only in relation to the United States, but I think globally. How do we kind of process information is one thing, but how do we make sure that people can have opposing views? I mean, the idea here is that one can have the right to disagree, but the law says you can't. So there's some dangerous aspect in relation to this, right? How do you codify? How do you create? I'm no lawyer, so I'll leave that up to you. But one thing that really I find extremely dangerous is how do you police free speech, and how do you in fact make it illegal, in some context. Ultimately, I want to believe that there's going to be a change in terms of how the Supreme Court ultimately is going to address those issues, but that takes a long time. But how do we, in fact, address, First Amendment rights is very critical. Universities is where people disagree. I mean, that's the very basic of it, right? Basic thing in relation to this. And to me, when I see numbers like, the quotes that you've mentioned, where 40% of Jewish Americans believe that what Israel committed is in fact genocide, that's massive. These are massive numbers. And I can give you more and more and more numbers. I mean, there's something to be said about, children of Holocaust survivors or Holocaust survivors themselves, in fact, calling out the actions of Israel as genocidal. There's something to be said about scholars of genocide who themselves, a lot of them are Jewish Americans and non-Jewish Americans, in fact, Israelis as well, Israeli Jewish scholars have in fact called it genocide. There's something to be said about that. You can basically decide to not listen to it, but ultimately it's there. And one way or another, those voices will be heard. And to me, as I say, I cannot emphasize the importance of Jewish American voices in recognizing the hypocrisy there. One, two, in addition, and to me, it's very significant and important how laws are passed on the local level, which I talk quite a bit in the book, as you know. But in particular, where there's one case, for example, in Texas, where there was a hurricane, and people, in order for them to receive any kit, like a tent and some services, in order for them to receive it from their own city, they needed to sign kind of a promise that they're never going to boycott Israel. Okay. How crazy is that? I mean, the idea here is very crazy. Now, in addition to this, excuse me, Kenneth Stern, one of the authors of the International Holocaust Remembers Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, he himself has been speaking about the fact that it had been weaponized. The person who wrote IRA says IRA has been weaponized. Do we listen to this person or do we not listen to this person? Do we take this person seriously or do we not take this person seriously? This is a legal question, to be honest. There's a legal question. One way or another, we have to deal with it. Targeting universities is probably the worst thing that can happen. This will make us no different than any other authoritarian regime, and in fact, maybe the worst authoritarian regime when we do something like this. Universities should not be targeted. Universities is where flow of information, the ideas are debated and discussed, and uncomfortableness is part of the conversation as well. Now, I also want to say that we whatever is happening in relation to Palestine, I have always thought that those, in terms talking about freedom of speech in relation to Palestine, are at the very forefront of conversations around freedom of speech for everybody, right? For everyone in the United States. So if we cannot and do not address those challenges, then we are in big trouble, I want to say. And ultimately, I mean, in the case of California that you mentioned, Newsom signed into law how K through 12 educational system, if a critique of Israel is considered to be anti-Semitic, and we've noticed that happening across the country. Like, I believe that ultimately that's going to be struck down. There's no question about it because in fact, it's illegal. Not only when it gets to that, but you cannot police people's ideas and also critique of Zionism is one thing, critique of the state of Israel is one thing, and critique of and anti-Semitism, which is a legitimate problem, obviously. They are separate. There is a growing number of Jewish Americans who do not identify with the practices of the state of Israel. And when you are connecting the two, in fact, I'm sorry to say, this becomes an anti-Semitic conversation. This becomes an anti-Semitic issue, that all Jews are one thing, all Jewish people are all supportive of the state of Israel. And that's problematic to me. Okay, as someone who is not Jewish, but I think that this is a conversation Jewish Americans have to have within themselves, individually and collectively, to think about where they stand in relation to this. And in fact, I also, in more recent years, this is a very significant debate that is taking place in Jewish American circles. Um, Jewish Americans are to think about whether or not Israel is where they want to put their allegiance with, right? Is this where do they see the practice of the state of Israel reflected in who they are? Do they see their values reflected and so on? So all I'm trying to say is that there's a debate, there's a conversation that is being had, and I'm told by my friends that at the local level, smaller synagogue levels, I mean, I've always found it to be interesting that the vast majority of synagogues, not all of them, synagogues in the United States have the Israeli flag inside, right? There's a national symbolism here within synagogues that really connects one's identity to the national identity of Israel, or the manifestation of the idea of Zionism and so on. And that's an intentional connection. That's an intentional connection. And that to me is problematic in the sense, would someone who happens to be Jewish want to identify with the practices of the state of Israel, be it on campus or off campus, be it in terms of defining what this critique of Israel as one that is anti-Semitic or not? That's a question that really we all have to ask ourselves. But primarily, I think this is a Jewish American conversation that needs to be had. A very serious conversation needs to be had within itself. But one last point in terms of this. Look, if history teaches us anything, and history can teach us stuff, right? Um, you cannot stop social movements. And I'm talking about how people's ideas and views in relation to something. I mean, I know that Omar Al-Aqad will be speaking at some point during this lecture series. I mean, yes, people will say, oh, we've always been against this at some point in history, but why not now? The question here is how do people acquire ideas at this particular moment? We've always asked questions. Why is it that ordinary men, which is a title of a book, Ordinary Men in Relation to Nazis, who in fact perpetrated by Chris Browning, wrote that book in the 1990s, ordinary men in terms of how ordinary people who happen to be German, in fact, and so on. And then they engage in practices that are so horrendous. How can a normal person do it? Well, unfortunately, ideas are similar. Ideas, if you support certain types of practices, then in fact you are enabling a genocide. So this is what I'm talking about. And this is a challenging moment that we are dealing with on multiple levels.
Thank you for that. And I do agree. I think that it's important that Jewish American communities have the freedom to have those conversations, just like Palestinian American communities should have the freedom to have their conversation, and Muslim American communities and Black communities. And some conversations are better within the intra-community context, the diversity within a cohesive, identifiable group of people, and intergroup. And I think the question or the challenge we face is that we have numerous organizations who are incorrectly claiming to represent all Jews, who are attacking Palestinian Muslim groups and denying them the right to have conversations, and seeking to criminalize it, seeking to silence it and censor it. And as we're seeing now with the growth of the far right, and we're starting to see the far right groups attack Jewish American groups, right? To turn on the ADL. And they've always been against many of the Jewish groups historically. You know, the anti-Semitism in America, its roots, its origins is in white Christian supremacy. And those groups, who are again are far right groups, they don't represent all Christians, they don't represent all white people, even though they may claim that they want to. They also hate Muslims, and they hate Arabs, and they hate Palestinians. And so I think it's just important that all of us remember that the objective of the university is to have the political freedom to to engage in open intellectual inquiry in a civil manner, in a professional manner, not to call each other names, not to
Absolutely.
try to hurt each
Not
other.
harassment, of course, absolutely. Yep, yep.
Right. And I say that, primarily because, as I said in my introduction, there are just so many organizations and individuals, unfortunately, and politicians who do not want the Center for Security, Race, and Rights to exist, who do not want you and I to have these conversations, who do not want a humanizing Palestine lecture series. And I find that those organizations pose some very serious threat to all of our free speech rights, all of our equality rights. And so I think it's important that we all do understand that to stand with Palestine is also to stand for equality, humanity, social justice for all. Because once you legitimize a genocide against one people, it's just a
You lose
matter of time where it becomes normalized and it will absolutely expand. And so I'd like to turn now to an audience question. You mentioned the decline of religious narratives, like those linking Israel's creation or place to Christian prophecy or Messiah coming, and how that shift might open space for new moral clarity. Given that both Christian and Muslim communities have invoked faith to justify opposing actions in what many of us, myself and you included, believe is a genocide in Gaza, how do you think these traditions, these religious traditions, can reconcile theological justification with a shared moral commitment to justice and human dignity?
Thank you. That's a really interesting question. I think, much of our conversation today comes back to the basic idea of rights. If people are able to understand that other people have their own views that may differ than their own, then we potentially might get somewhere. Look, is this going to, again, the theology, that's one interpretation, by the way, I want to say. Not all Christians believe in what I've mentioned, the idea that the return of the Messiah has to be with the manifested first in the return of all Jews to, etc. Right? I'm not generalizing here. All I have to say is that this is a very strong undercurrent of American form of Christianity, Protestant Christianity, that really sees this particular, especially in evangelical spaces. And I also want to mention that this is being challenged currently, as you've mentioned, to the audience member who asked the question. This is being challenged on multiple fronts, and it's not only in the quote unquote leftist spaces, and it's not only in synagogues that it's being, but it's also being challenged within different churches. And again, I cannot. Look, there's something to be said in relation to the fact that a lot of people, when they read my book, said, "Oh, there is such a thing as a Palestinian Christian." What? And in fact, like to me, that was quite surprising because Palestinian Christians have been there since the days of Jesus Christ. I mean, and also I want to say I was born 12 miles south of where Jesus was born. But obviously that has nothing to do with it because Jesus is blonde and blue-eyed, right? But so the idea here is very strange how manufacturing a certain narrative, manufacturing a certain image, manufacturing a certain kind of belief structure that is packaged, prepackaged for you to carry and move on with your life. And if it's not challenged, it stays there forever and it's passed from one generation to another. But what happened over the past 20 so years is that that has been challenged. And I think on a global level, all traditional ideas are being challenged. Okay. Think about gay marriage. Think about the fact that BIPOC communities are standing up in the United States and globally, not only in the United States. Younger people are fighting for, I mean, I can give you a list of places where that is taking place, right? So all I have to say is that there are changes that are taking place in relation to how those prepackaged belief structures are being passed from one generation to another, one. And then two, um, ultimately, as I said, like, ultimately, truth will prevail for better or for worse. People will, in fact, understand ultimately that the freedom of Palestinians is something significant, not only for Palestinians, which it should be, but also it's significant for their own freedom. It's very significant for their own faith. It's very significant and important for their own belief system. I mean, if we go back to the basics, if we go back to the basics about rights, and there's a lot of, oftentimes, I mean, we all know that race is a socially constructed concept, obviously. It means that there's a meaning attributed to certain facial characteristics and physical characteristics. There's also meaning associated with ethnic characteristics and so on, linguistical, and we can go on down the list, but they are socially constructed. What the hell does that actually mean? It means that people, in fact, they and I don't they're born without any of that. Okay, so the socialization process gives you ideas around how do you discriminate or not discriminate, and kind of understand that there's a racial hierarchy subconsciously based on these meanings that have been already defined for you, and through the process of socialization you acquire them. But then there's also the process of socialization itself can be corrected. And I think there are Christian spaces, churches around virtually. I mean, I read about them; they're everywhere, right? Where within the church itself, there are conversations around, where do our sympathies need to lie? Is it in relation to what Jesus would say, or is it in relation to what my pastor would say? And I'm sorry to put it in these terms, but the idea is, what would Jesus do? And honestly, it's the basic question. What would Jesus do? And I actually once someone asked me a similar question, and I said, well, I'm not Christian, but I can only ask you, what would Jesus do in these circumstances? And that person says, oh, thank you, that's easy for me. Okay, well, maybe that's is how people need to go back to the basics to understand where the rights are significant and important, to understand that empathy is very significant and important, to understand that no one is worthy of more sympathy than others. Humans are humans. And if anything, unfortunately, the past 2 years have taught us anything. They have taught us that genocide of certain people is fully acceptable. Starving people has been unfortunately acceptable. Where do people want to stand in relation to this? That's the question.
Thank you so much. I wish we had more time. I would encourage everyone to read Professor Dana's book, To Stand with Palestine, Transnational Resistance and Political Evolution in the United States. It's so rich with facts and a very overarching, cohesive kind of theorization of the social justice movement that has incorporated Palestinian experiences and history and grievances and joy and aspirations. And I hope that we can continue to counter all of the hate against this community. And I think that hate is on full display by virtue of the fact that the way our government responds to the murder of over 1,200 Israelis on October 7th, 2023 is very, very different and much more sympathetic and humanistic as compared to the way that our government has completely dehumanized the murder of over 65,000 Palestinians, and more likely tens of thousands of more Palestinians who died under the rubble, 2 million who have been starved, massively intentionally starved by the state of Israel and supported with US funding and political cover, and the way in which most of Gaza, has been destroyed, right, by the state of Israel. And yet all we do is say, well, it's very complicated. It's war. It's Hamas's fault. And so there is a very different response. And that to me is evidence that our country and our society does not see Palestinians as equal to Israeli Jews. And I think the most important thing is that we treat everyone equally, with respect, with dignity, and value their lives. And until we get to that point, we have a very serious racism problem, right? Anti-Palestinian racism problem in America. So I'll just put a pitch for our report, Presumptively Anti-Semitic, Islamophobic Tropes in the Palestine-Israel Discourse, which I co-authored with Mitchell Plitnick. So I encourage people to read that book, read this report, in addition to reading Professor Dana's book. I also encourage all of you to follow us on social media. And if you found this talk informative, please consider making a financial donation to the Center for Security, Race, and Rights. Go to csrr.rutgers.edu, press the donate button. If you want to counter all of the hate and all of the attacks against us, support us financially and share all of the information and knowledge that our excellent experts and esteemed guests express and share in their own research and in the lecture series that we have. And finally, please do register for the next lecture in Humanizing Palestine, which will be on October 22nd. And so with that, thank you so much, Professor Dana. Thank you for all of your research. Thank you for your courage. And thank you for everyone who attended today. And I hope that all of us together, working together, we will pursue education and open intellectual inquiry as an antidote to hate and authoritarianism. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, Sahar.